The Air Classic BW was originally released by Nike in 1991. And back in those days, it was actually called the Air Max 4. You know how the Air Max 90 used to be called the Air Max 3? Well, a year later, Nike released these classic BWs and they called them the Air Max 4. It really wasn't renamed the Air Classic BW until the retro era many years later. Something else that's interesting about the name of this shoe, it's not called the Air Max Classic BW, it's just the Air Classic BW. And that's sort of strange and confusing because when you look at the shoe, it's gonna say Air Max all over it. A shoe that has a visible air window is called an Air Max, so you would think that this would be called the Air Max Classic BW, but for whatever reason, it isn't. So this shoe, the big deal about it is that the air window on it was the biggest that Nike had ever put on a shoe up until this point in time. So of course, you know, in the ShoeZeum, I had toys and props that bring shoes to life. And so I had to have a big giant window on display next to all of these Air Classic BWs. And I absolutely loved walking the guests of the ShoeZeum through the running section up to this shoe and telling them that BW stood for big window and that these were the biggest windows up until 1991. So I think this shoe is very underrated, and I actually think it should have been included in the history of Air Pack that celebrated iconic running shoes from the first 20 years of the Air Max line. This shoe is overlooked and it's not retroed nearly as often as like the Air Max 1, the Air Max 90, the 95, the 97. It's just been overlooked. But in recent times, Nike has started retroing them, and I think they're going to retro more and more of these cool shoes because they would love nothing more than to have another Air Max take off that they could keep cranking out in color after color after color. So let's have a look at some of these shoes. I used to pick them up at Nike outlets for like $19.99 and $24.99 back in the day, and they would almost always sell to people in Germany and the Netherlands. It's funny how some shoes are more popular in certain parts of the world than they are in others. And when the Nike executives came and visited me, I told them it's silly that you're giving away these shoes at the outlets when you can just redirect them to Germany where people will pay top dollar for them. And I think they were definitely scratching their heads about that. And you definitely don't see shoes at Nike outlets for nearly as cheap as they used to be back in the day. Let's have a look at these shoes. We'll start over here with the Persian Violet colorway, the original color of the Air Max Classic BW, or the Air Classic BW, like they like to call it. And this shoe is just amazing. This last year, Nike started retroing some of their Air Max runners, and they called them the OG edition, meaning original, and they were meant to look vintage. And this pair of Persian Violet Classic BWs just came out not too long ago. It came out alongside a pair of ultramarine Air 180s. And that's another funny thing, the Air 180 is also another shoe with a visible air window that's not called an Air Max 180, for whatever reason. Anyway, let's have a look over here at the third pair. This is the Air Classic BW Gen 2, and Gen 2 means Generation 2. I found out about this shoe because a fellow sneakerhead in New York named Dwight Bodycott posted pictures wearing them, and I thought, damn, those are super cool. Went straight to eBay, picked them up. It looks a lot like the original BW, except that it's got this new mesh edition that's sort of reminiscent of like the Air Max 2011. Now let's look over here at the brown pair. The colorway is actually called Rustic, and I had hundreds of these back in the day. I picked them up at Nike outlets for $19.99, and I used to sell them for like 75 bucks. And I nicknamed them the A&W Root Beer. You can see I have a bottle of A&W Root Beer here, and the logo and colors match the shoes perfectly. And I think that's actually a lot of how sneakers get nicknamed. Because Nike's actually not allowed to nickname the shoes themselves because they would get sued by the owners of these companies if they didn't pay for the rights to put A&W on that shoe. It's sort of up to sneakerheads like you and me to come up with nicknames for these shoes. And I always was flattered when I would sell a shoe on eBay like this, and I'd call it the A&W Root Beer, and then I would see later on other people calling it that and selling the same shoe with the same nickname. Now let's look up here. You'll see a pair of black BWs, a pair of white BWs. These shoes have a lot of plastic on them, and they're known for like really yellowing. I hated buying these shoes and sitting on them because even if they sat in their boxes in a perfect environment, the clear plastic would turn yellow over time. So the black to white to black and white, the ShoeZeum was hypnotizing. And when I displayed shoes, it was always by color. And so if you were going to go from black to white, you had to go to black and white, and then pretty much every color in the rainbow in between. And then over here, I want to talk about a pair of limited edition classic BWs. These are known as the Paris Saint Germain edition. They're named after a soccer club in Paris, and the colorway is super dope, red, white, and blue. Of course, you can never go wrong with a speckled midsole, sort of reminiscent of the Air Jordan 4. This is one of very, very few rare collectible classic BWs. Really, as I sit here, I can only think of this pair, the camo ones that released in this past year, and then the original Nintendo Entertainment System classic BWs. I think if Nike were to start retroing a few of these classic BWs in limited edition colorways and partnered up with other boutiques, it would create real hype and demand for this shoe, and who knows, maybe this could be elevated to the level of some of those runners in the history of Airpack, and we could get a whole bunch of them in a bunch of different colors and cool patterns and uppers. We'll see.